The winter wind cut through the narrow streets of Boston like a blade, carrying with it the sound of carriage wheels, church bells, and the hollow echo of Clara Whitmore's footsteps. At 19, she had already buried both parents and every dream she once dared to nurture. Her father's shipping business had collapsed after his sudden death, leaving behind debts that her mother's fragile health and delicate manners could not erase. When the fever took her mother too, Clara became not a daughter but a liability, a debt to be settled. Her guardian, a stern man named Mr. Ellison, managed her late father's affairs with the warmth of a winter stone. He fed her and kept her roofed, but each day his patience thinned. By the time she turned 19, his words had sharpened into threats. "You'll marry, girl, or find yourself on the street." Marriage, however, had never been something Clara considered lightly. In Boston society, she had once attended dances and teas, her blue eyes and honey-colored hair marking her as a beauty with promise. But the moment her family fell, invitations stopped. The same women who'd praised her lace gloves now crossed the street to avoid her. Poverty, she discovered, was a more potent disease than any fever. Then, one gray morning, Mr. Ellison brought her a letter. It bore no familiar crest or handwriting, only a crude seal of wax and the faint scent of tobacco. Inside, written in an awkward but careful hand, was an advertisement from an established homesteader in the Arizona Territory seeking a wife. The man promised a home, protection, and stability. In exchange, he required only companionship and a woman of respectable character willing to brave frontier life. Clara's stomach tightened as she read. The very idea seemed absurd, to marry a stranger hundreds of miles away, sight unseen. Yet what choice remained? She had no dowry, no family name to barter, and no employment prospects save for servitude. Still, she hesitated. The frontier was a place spoken of in whispers, wild, lawless, unforgiving. But so too, she realized, was her present life. Every passing day in Boston stripped her of dignity. The lodgings Mr. Ellison offered grew colder, the meals smaller. His tone toward her grew less paternal and more possessive. And so, when he pressed her hand to the paper and said, "Sign it, girl. It's the best you'll ever do," she did. A week later, Clara's passage was arranged. She was to travel by train to St. Louis, then by stagecoach into the Arizona Territory, where her new husband, a man named John Hawthorne, would meet her at Fort Verde. She spent her last evening in Boston packing a worn carpetbag. Inside, she placed her mother's brooch, a small prayer book, and a faded photograph of her parents on their wedding day. It was the only image she had of happiness, and she clung to it as though it could protect her from the unknown. When dawn broke, the city's chimneys bled smoke into the cold air. Clara stood on the platform, heart pounding, as the train hissed and clattered to life. She wondered, as the iron wheels began to turn, whether she was running toward a future or merely away from her past. Days bled into nights as the train thundered across the country. The farther west she went, the more the world seemed to expand and empty. The genteel landscapes of New England gave way to plains of gold and dust, to endless skies that made her feel both free and terribly small. Along the way, she wrote letters she never sent, little confessions to her mother, telling her of the red sunsets, the smell of prairie grass, the faces of people who looked at her with curiosity instead of pity. By the time she reached Arizona, the air itself seemed different, sharper, drier, tinged with smoke and sage. When the stagecoach halted at the wooden outpost of Fort Verde, the driver called out her name with a mix of pity and confusion. "Miss Whitmore, you're the one for Mr. Hawthorne, ain't you?" She stepped down, clutching her carpetbag, and scanned the crowd. Soldiers, traders, and native men lingered near the edge of the post, but no one stepped forward. Then a silence fell. From the edge of the gathering, an imposing figure emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, his skin bronze under the sun, his black hair tied with a strip of leather. He wore no uniform, no hat, only a beaded necklace and a calm, unreadable gaze. The driver muttered under his breath, "Well, That's no settler." Clara's heart lurched. The man approached slowly, deliberately, his dark eyes meeting hers. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but clear. "I am Taza. You are my wife." The world seemed to tilt beneath her. She looked around at the startled faces, the soldiers' wary stare, and realized, with a chill that sank deep into her bones, that her desperate promise had bound her not to the life she imagined, but to something far stranger, far more dangerous than she could ever have dreamed. The sun hung low over the Arizona desert, casting long, copper shadows across the dust-choked outpost of Fort Verde. The world seemed to blur before Clara's eyes. The soldiers frozen in disbelief, the murmuring settlers edging backward, and in the center of it all stood the man who had just spoken the words that changed her life. "I am Taza. You are my wife." Clara's breath caught. Surely there had been some mistake. The letter, the arrangement, all of it had spoken of a settler named John Hawthorne, not this tall, bronze-skinned man in tribal garb. She swallowed hard, clutching her carpetbag as though it could anchor her to reality. I think there's been a misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice trembling. "My husband. He's an Englishman. His name is Hawthorne." Taza's expression did not change. His eyes, dark and steady, studied her face as if weighing the truth in her words. Then with quiet certainty he replied, "Hawthorne is dead." The words fell heavy in the dry air. For a moment all Clara could hear was the crackle of wind through brittle grass and the faint jingle of a soldier's spurs. "Dead," she whispered. "When how?" A man in a faded uniform stepped forward, the fort's commander judging by his brass insignia and the permanent scowl etched into his sun-worn face. "Miss Whitmore," he said gruffly. "Mr. Hawthorne was killed 2 months ago in a skirmish north of here. Bandits attacked a supply wagon. He didn't make it." Clara's knees weakened. The bag slipped from her hand, spilling her few possessions onto the dirt. A ribbon, a brush, the faded photograph of her parents. The commander hesitated, then cleared his throat. "There was another matter. Before he died, Hawthorne made an agreement with the local Apache chief Cochise. To ensure peace in this territory, he offered a union, a symbolic one. The chief's son, Taza, would marry a woman of settler blood, a gesture of trust." Clara stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. "And you mean to say, that woman," the commander said grimly, "was you?" Gasps rippled through the onlookers. One woman covered her mouth, muttering something about savages. Another spat into the dirt. Clara could barely process the words. Her husband-to-be was dead, and the only reason she had been summoned to this wasteland was to take his place, to marry a stranger, an Apache for the sake of a treaty she had never agreed to. "This is madness," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't consent to this." The commander's eyes softened slightly, not with compassion but weariness. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore, but if you refuse, the deal falls apart, and the deal keeps this fort standing." She turned to Taza, desperate for some sign of understanding, but his face remained unreadable. "You would force me into this?" she demanded. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, not anger, but something closer to sadness. "I force nothing," he said. "Your people arranged this. My father honored it." He paused, then added quietly, "You may hate me if you must, but know this, I did not ask for you either." The honesty in his tone struck her harder than any insult could. Around them, the crowd began to murmur again, settlers hissing curses under their breath, soldiers watching with cold detachment. The commander motioned toward the chapel. "Best we get on with it," he muttered, "before someone decides peace isn't worth the trouble." Clara wanted to run, to flee into the desert, to wake and find herself back in her narrow Boston room, still poor, but safe, still herself. Yet as she looked around, she saw only hardened faces and empty sky. There was nowhere to run. The promise she had signed months ago had become a chain she could not break. When she met Taza's gaze again, she expected scorn or triumph. Instead, she found patience, a calm dignity that unsettled her more than cruelty ever could. He stepped closer, close enough for her to see the faint scar along his jaw, the tiny beads woven into the leather tie at his neck. His voice was low, steady. "I will not harm you, Clara Whitmore. That is not our way. But today, before your people and mine, the words must be spoken." She wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that she was a victim of men's politics and promises, but her voice failed her. The commander signaled the chaplain. The murmuring died to silence. And so, beneath a burning sky, Clara Whitmore stood beside the man the world had told her to fear, listening as words of binding were spoken in 2 tongues, English and Apache. Each syllable felt like a stone being laid upon her chest. But when it was done and the witnesses dispersed, Taza turned to her, bowed slightly, and said only, "You are free to rest. Tomorrow we ride home." Home. The word struck her like thunder, because for the first time she realized whatever home awaited her now would be nothing like the one she had lost. The chapel at Fort Verde was nothing more than a small wooden structure, its white paint blistered by the sun and its windows clouded with dust. Inside, the air was stifling, heavy with the scent of sweat, candle wax and tension so thick it seemed to hum. Clara stood near the altar, her hands clasped tightly around the worn prayer book she'd brought from Boston. It was the only remnant of her old life, and she held it like a shield. Outside, through the warped window, she could see faces pressed to the glass, settlers, soldiers, traders, and their wives, all come to witness the spectacle of a white woman marrying an Apache. She could feel their eyes on her like hot needles. Her dress, once pale blue, was wrinkled from travel, its hem frayed by desert dust. She had no veil, no flowers, no friends to stand beside her. Even the chaplain avoided her gaze, reading from his Bible with the nervous rhythm of a man who wanted the moment over quickly. Then the door opened. Taza entered without a sound. He wore a deerskin tunic, clean and adorned with small turquoise beads that caught the light. His long black hair was braided neatly, and though his expression was calm, Clara sensed the unease in him too, a tension beneath the surface, like the still air before a storm. He walked to the front and stopped a respectful distance from her. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. His were not cruel as she had feared, only solemn, steady, and impossibly deep. The chaplain cleared his throat. "We are gathered here," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "to join these two souls in the bonds of holy matrimony." A murmur rippled through the crowd outside. Someone whispered, "A Christian service for a savage?" Another voice, low and mocking, answered, "Maybe he'll scalp her after." Laughter followed. Clara's cheeks burned. She kept her gaze fixed on the Bible, refusing to meet their eyes. The chaplain read the vows quickly, almost mechanically. "Do you, Taza of the Apache, take this woman, Clara Whitmore, to be your wedded wife?" For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then Taza spoke, his accent faint but his English clear. "I take her." His tone was quiet, but the words carried through the room like a drumbeat. The chaplain turned to Clara. "And do you, Miss Whitmore, take this man?" Her mouth was dry. Her heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint. She had dreamed once of love, of a kind gentleman who might take her hand beneath a candle-lit ballroom ceiling. Yet here she stood in the dust and heat, about to bind her life to a man she barely knew, surrounded by people who wanted her to fail. She drew in a breath and whispered, "I do." The chaplain looked visibly relieved. He closed the Bible and said, "Then by the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you." He never finished the sentence. Taza lifted a hand, halting him. The room tensed. Clara froze. Slowly, Taza turned toward the gathered witnesses, the settlers who glared at him, the soldiers who watched with suspicion. Then he did something that made every person in that chapel gasp. He bowed, not a shallow nod, not a mocking gesture, but a full, respectful bow, his head lowered and his hand placed across his chest. When he straightened, he turned to Clara and repeated the gesture before her, his voice steady and clear. "Among my people," he said, "a man does not own the woman he marries. He honors her. She walks beside him, not behind." The word stunned her. Even the chaplain hesitated, unsure how to continue. Outside, the muttering turned into shocked silence. Taza reached into a small pouch tied to his belt and withdrew a cedar box, polished smooth and carved with symbols Clara did not recognize. He held it out to her with both hands. "This," he said softly, "belonged to my mother. Inside is my promise, not that you must stay, but that if you do, you will be free." Clara's trembling hands accepted the box. It was light, warm from the sun. She opened it carefully, and inside, wrapped in cloth, lay a small silver locket. When she touched it, it clicked open to reveal a faded image of a young Apache woman with dark eyes and a gentle smile. Beneath it, a scrap of parchment. Written in English in an unsteady hand were the words, "You are not my possession. You are free to choose." A hush fell over the room. Even the chaplain seemed moved, his voice faltering as he finally declared them husband and wife. When it was done, Taza turned and offered her his arm. Clara hesitated, then took it, not because she was forced to, but because she wanted to understand this man who had just given her something no one else ever had. Choice. As they stepped out into the blinding sunlight, the whispers rose again, but this time Clara barely heard them. For in the heart of the desert, among strangers and skeptics, something unexpected had begun. Not love, not yet, but the fragile beginning of respect. The ceremony had ended, yet the weight of it lingered in the air like smoke. The townsfolk dispersed reluctantly, muttering as they went, some in outrage, others in disbelief. Clara heard fragments of their whispers drift on the wind. Shameful. God help her. She'll be dead before winter. She ignored them all. Her thoughts were fixed on the cedar box still clutched in her hands. Its smooth surface was carved with symbols she didn't recognize. Flowing lines that reminded her of rivers and wind. Circles that seemed to represent the sun and moon. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and sage, like something ancient and alive. Taza stood a few paces away, speaking with the fort's commander. His words were quiet, measured. Clara could not hear what he said, but she noticed the commander's discomfort. The way his eyes darted anywhere but at Taza's face. When they finished, Taza turned toward her. "Come," he said simply. Clara hesitated, unsure whether she was expected to follow him or not. The chapel steps felt higher now, heavier. She glanced at the commander as if hoping for guidance, but he only nodded stiffly. "You're his wife now, Miss Whitmore. You'll go with him." The word wife struck her like a stone. It felt unreal, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. Still, she gathered her skirt and followed. Outside, a small group of Apache men and women waited near a pair of painted horses. They watched her silently, their expressions unreadable. One of the women, her dark hair streaked with silver, offered Clara a small smile, tentative but genuine. It was the first kindness Clara had felt since arriving in the territory, and it steadied her trembling hands. Taza helped her onto the horse, his touch careful and brief. She noticed again how quietly he moved, how every gesture seemed deliberate, never wasted. When he mounted his own horse beside her, he turned to her and said, "We ride for my home. It is one day's journey. You may rest when you wish." Clara nodded, unsure of what to say. The fort shrank behind them as they rode eastward into the desert, the land stretching out like an ocean of red and gold. For hours there was no sound but the wind and the rhythmic beat of hooves. As the sun sank low, they stopped near a cluster of mesquite trees beside a shallow stream. The Apache companions built a small fire while Taza brought her water and dried meat wrapped in cloth. She thanked him softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. They ate in silence, the orange light flickering over his face. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with uncertainty. Why did you give me this?" she asked, holding up the cedar box. "You said it was your mother's." Taza's eyes flickered toward the fire. "She was a strong woman," he said. "She taught me that love cannot live where there is fear. When she died, she gave me this box and said, 'Give it to the woman you marry, if you can give it with peace in your heart.'" Clara ran her thumb over the carvings. "And you gave it to me? Even though you didn't choose this?" He met her gaze then, steady, direct, but not unkind. "I did not choose you," he admitted. "But I chose not to make you a prisoner. That is the only choice I could make." His words struck something deep within her. All her life she had been passed from one decision to another. Her father's debts, her guardian's schemes, this unwanted marriage. No one had ever offered her the chance to choose anything at all. When she looked down at the locket inside the box again, she noticed something she hadn't before. A tiny inscription etched along the inner rim of the silver. The letters were faint but clear. "To honor is to be free." She closed the locket gently. "Your mother must have been wise." "She was," Taza said quietly. "She would have liked you." For a moment silence settled between them. Not the cold silence of fear, but a softer one, shaped by respect. The wind rustled through the mesquite branches, carrying with it the distant cry of a coyote. Clara stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in her eyes. "Back in Boston," she said half to herself, "people would have laughed at the idea of respect before marriage. They would have said a husband's duty is to rule and a wife's to obey." Taza tilted his head slightly. "And did that make them happy?" She gave a small, tired smile. "No, I suppose it didn't." He said nothing more. Instead, he added another log to the fire, the sparks drifting upward like scattered stars. Clara felt the fatigue of the long journey settling over her. When she finally lay down beneath the desert sky, the cedar box pressed against her heart. She found that for the first time since leaving Boston, she wasn't afraid. She didn't yet trust Taza, but she believed him, and somehow that belief was enough to let her sleep. The desert dawn came quietly, a soft blush of rose and gold spreading across the horizon. Clara awoke to the sound of low voices and the gentle crackle of rekindled fire. For a moment she forgot where she was, that she was no longer in Boston, no longer a girl waiting for permission to live. Then the scent of wood smoke and sage brought her back to the reality of Arizona, and to the man who sat across from her, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. Taza. He looked up as she stirred. "You slept," he said simply. "Yes," she replied, surprised to find that she had. The ground beneath her was hard, her blanket thin, and yet she had slept soundly. "Thank you," she added after a moment. He nodded once as though accepting gratitude were an unnecessary formality. "We leave soon. You may wash in the stream." Clara rose, still sore from the long ride, and made her way to the water. The reflection that stared back at her was almost unrecognizable. Hair tangled, skin flushed from the sun, eyes ringed with exhaustion. Yet beneath the fatigue she saw something else, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. She was not the frightened girl who had stepped off the stagecoach yesterday. Something in her had shifted, subtly but undeniably, the night before, when Taza had said, "I did not choose you, but I chose not to make you a prisoner." It was the first time in her life anyone had given her the power to decide her own fate. When she returned, the others were ready to ride. The older Apache woman who had smiled at her earlier handed Clara a strip of cloth dyed in deep red and gestured toward her hair. "For son," she said haltingly, wrapping it gently around Clara's head. Clara murmured a shy thank you, touched by the simple kindness. They set out again, riding east toward the rising sun. The land unfolded in endless shades of ochre and gold, mesas in the distance, sparse brush, the occasional hawk circling overhead. Though the journey was silent, it was not uncomfortable. Taza rode slightly ahead, guiding the way with a quiet confidence that seemed born of the land itself. By midday, they reached a wide valley where the remnants of old dwellings dotted the landscape. Stone circles, half-buried fire pits, traces of a life that had endured despite the desert's cruelty. Taza raised a hand, signaling a halt. "This is my home," he said. "Our people live beyond the ridge." Clara shaded her eyes against the glare. She could just make out a cluster of lodges made from hide and willow frames. The sight filled her with an odd mix of wonder and dread. As they descended the ridge, curious faces appeared. Women grinding corn, children peeking from behind blankets, men watching her with wary eyes. Clara felt their scrutiny like heat on her skin. Some murmured softly to one another, their tone neither hostile nor welcoming, simply, cautious. Taza dismounted first. Then, with an unreadable expression, he extended a hand to her. She hesitated, but then, squaring her shoulders, she placed her hand in his and let him help her down. "This is Clara," he announced to those who had gathered. "She is my wife." A ripple of reaction passed through the crowd. Some nodded. Others turned away. Clara stood tall, refusing to bow her head even as her heart thundered in her chest. Later, when the crowd had dispersed and she stood near the edge of the camp, she felt Taza's presence beside her. "They will need time," he said quietly. "You are unexpected." "I imagine I am," she replied, her tone dry. Then she added more softly, "And I will need time as well." He looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. "You could leave," he said. "Tomorrow I can take you back to the fort. The treaty would hold. No one would stop you." Clara turned to face him fully. The wind caught the edge of her skirt, tugging it gently like a living thing. "And what would I go back to?" she asked. "A guardian who sold me like a parcel? A city that forgot me?" He said nothing. She took a breath and lifted her chin. "No, I will stay. Not because I must, but because I want to understand you, your people, this life." Taza's brows lifted slightly, the faintest trace of surprise crossing his otherwise stoic face. "You would live among us?" "Yes," she said firmly. "But not as your possession, as your equal." For a long moment he regarded her in silence. Then slowly he inclined his head. "Then you are braver than most who come to our land." Clara smiled faintly, though there was steel beneath it. "Or more foolish," Sometimes, Taza said, his lips curving in the faintest shadow of a smile. They are the same thing. That night, as the desert cooled and the sky turned deep indigo, Clara sat by the fire, the cedar box resting in her lap. Around her, the camp moved with quiet rhythm, the sounds of laughter, low conversation, the distant cry of a night bird. She felt the strangeness of it all, yes, but also something else. A fragile sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. The world that had cast her aside had given her to this man. But she would decide what that gift meant. Clara Whitmore, once powerless and poor, had made her first true choice, and it would change everything that came after. The first week in the Apache village tested every ounce of Clara's resolve. Nothing resembled the world she had known, not the food, the customs, the language, or the rhythms of the day. Time seemed to move differently here, measured not by clock towers or church bells, but by the position of the sun and the whisper of wind through the red canyons. At dawn, the camp stirred to life. Women emerged from lodges to grind corn, children fetched water from the stream, and men prepared to hunt or ride patrols along the ridges. The smell of wood smoke mingled with the earthy scent of damp clay and mesquite. Clara rose early too, unsure of what she should do or where she fit among them. Taza was gone most mornings before the sun rose fully. When she asked where, one of the women, the same silver-haired one who had offered her the red headcloth, told her gently, "He watches the land. The soldiers move. He must know." Clara nodded, not entirely understanding, but grateful for the woman's soft tone. The woman's name was Nalan, and she became Clara's first friend. Though their words were few, Clara spoke almost no Apache, and Nalan's English was halting. They found ways to communicate through gestures and smiles. Nalan showed her how to grind cornmeal using smooth stones, how to weave reeds into simple baskets, and how to tie a water gourd with strips of hide so it could hang from her shoulder. The work was harder than anything Clara had ever done, but it steadied her nerves. At night her arms ached, her hands blistered, but she felt a satisfaction she'd never known in Boston, where her every movement had once been dictated by etiquette and propriety. Here she learned survival. Still, she was an outsider. She felt it in every glance that lingered too long, in the whispers that quieted when she approached. Once, as she carried a basket of corn to the fire, a young warrior muttered something sharp in Apache that made the others laugh. Clara didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking. Before she could retreat, a shadow fell across them. Taza. He had returned silently, as he always did. His eyes were dark and unreadable, but his voice was calm when he spoke to the warrior. Low and firm, the words clipped but not angry. Whatever he said, it silenced the laughter immediately. The young man lowered his gaze and murmured an apology. Clara stood frozen, the basket heavy in her hands. When Taza turned to her, she expected reproach, maybe even pity. Instead, he said quietly, "They do not yet understand you. Give them time." His words surprised her, not just for their kindness, but for the quiet authority behind them. "And you?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Do you understand me?" Something flickered in his eyes, amusement perhaps. "Not yet," he admitted, "but I will try." That evening, Taza invited her to join a small gathering by the fire. Elders told stories, not read from books, but spoken in the musical cadence of memory. Nalan sat beside Clara, translating in fragments. Tales of the first man and woman who were shaped from the dust, of the eagle who carried the sun, of the coyote whose foolishness taught people wisdom. Clara listened, entranced. Each story held something deeper than myth, lessons about humility, courage, and balance with the land. She realized with growing awe that this was not a culture of savagery as the newspapers had called it. It was one of profound grace. Later, when the stories ended and the stars had filled the sky, she found Taza sitting apart, sharpening his knife by firelight. She hesitated, then approached. "You protect them," she said softly, "even when they don't see it." He looked up, the blade glinting orange in the light. "It is what a leader does. Are you their leader?" He shrugged lightly. "One of them." "A voice, not the only one." He paused, then added, "You begin to see. The world is not as your books told you." Clara smiled faintly. "Nor as your people were told about mine, I suspect." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Perhaps," Silence fell between them, not awkward but companionable. The night wind carried the scent of rain from the far mountains, and for a fleeting moment, Clara felt something she had not felt since childhood: belonging. She still didn't know if she could ever love this man. But she knew with quiet certainty that she no longer feared him. When she returned to her small lodge, the cedar box sat where she had left it. She opened it once more, tracing the carved symbols with her fingertips. To honor is to be free. Somewhere beyond the lodge walls, she heard Taza's voice, soft, low, speaking to someone unseen. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone carried warmth, almost tenderness. Clara lay down, smiling faintly to herself. The desert had a way of humbling even the strongest spirit. By the second month in the Apache village, Clara began to feel its power not just in her mind but in her body. The days were hotter than any summer she had known, the nights colder than she thought possible. The sun burned her pale skin no matter how carefully she covered herself, and the dry wind stole her strength little by little. At first, she tried to ignore it. She kept working beside Nalin, grinding corn, washing clothes in the stream, helping the children gather berries from the brush. But her hands grew weak, her breath shorter. Then came the fever. It began as a faint ache in her temples, then a heat that crawled across her skin like fire. By the third day, she could no longer stand without dizziness. Her vision blurred, and the camp sounds, the laughter, the horses, the chatter of children, faded into a dull roar. When Taza found her, she was slumped beside the fire, her lips cracked, her skin pale as parchment. He knelt quickly, his hand cool against her brow. "You are burning," he murmured. "I'm fine," she tried to whisper, but her voice failed her. The world tilted and everything went black. When she woke, she was lying inside Taza's own lodge. The woven walls glowed softly with filtered light, and the air smelled of cedar and crushed herbs. Her head throbbed, but her body no longer shook. Beside her, a small clay bowl steamed gently, filling the space with a sharp, earthy scent. Nalin sat nearby, grinding more herbs. When she saw Clara stir, she smiled. "He would not leave, Kya," she said in slow, careful English. Clara frowned weakly. "Who?" As if in answer, the door flap lifted and Taza stepped inside. His hair was loose, his face drawn with exhaustion. He carried a water skin and a damp cloth. Without a word, he knelt beside her, pressing the cool cloth to her forehead. "You should rest," she said hoarsely. "You've been up all night." "I will rest when you do," he replied simply. Something in his tone, firm yet gentle, quieted her protest. For the next few days, Taza remained by her side. He prepared her medicine from wild herbs, feeding her water in careful sips. Sometimes through the long hours of the night, she drifted in and out of fevered dreams, visions of her mother, of Boston streets, of the day she had first seen him standing before her at the fort. And always through the haze, his voice anchored her, low, steady, speaking to her in a mixture of English and words she did not yet understand. At one point, she awoke to find him sitting outside the lodge, his back against the wooden post, watching the stars. She was too weak to move, but she listened as he murmured something softly, a chant or prayer, perhaps. His voice carried a note of sorrow that touched her heart in ways she couldn't explain. When the fever finally broke, she felt hollowed out but alive. The air was cool against her skin, and the sky beyond the lodge flap had deepened into twilight. Taza was there, as always, tending a small fire. She tried to sit up. "How long?" 7 days, he said. "You fought the fever hard." She blinked, stunned. "You stayed all that time?" He looked at her as if the question made no sense. "Would I have left?" Her throat tightened. "You barely know me." He turned toward the fire, his expression unreadable. "You are my wife. Not by your choice or mine, but still you are under my care. If I let you die, I would dishonor myself." His words were simple, but his voice carried something deeper, an emotion he did not name. Gratitude, perhaps, or something more. "Then I owe you my life," Clara whispered. He shook his head. "No, you owe me nothing. You live because you are strong." They sat in silence, the firelight painting their faces in shades of gold and shadow. For the first time, Clara saw him not as a stranger or a symbol of everything she had lost, but as a man, steady, principled, and quietly kind. When Nalin entered later to bring broth, Clara caught her smiling knowingly. "You heal now," Nalin said, eyes twinkling. "Strong heart. Clara blushed, but Taza merely gave a faint, almost shy smile, the first she had ever seen from him. That night, as she drifted to sleep beside the gentle crackle of the fire, she felt an unfamiliar peace settle over her. The desert still frightened her. The future remained uncertain, but something between them had shifted. The man who had once been a stranger bound to her by duty had become her protector, her healer. And perhaps, if fate allowed, something even more. The desert stretched endlessly under a sky of brilliant blue, but beauty often masks danger. Clara had begun to grow accustomed to the rhythms of the Apache village, the rising sun, the quiet chores, the soft cadence of stories around the fire. Yet even in this land she was learning to call home. Tension lingered beneath the surface. Not all outsiders respected the fragile peace between settlers and the Apache. It began with a distant cloud of dust on the horizon. At first, Clara thought it was merely travelers or traders making their way along the dusty trail. But the horse's nervous whinnies and Taza's sudden alertness told her otherwise. "They come," Taza said quietly, mounting his horse with practiced speed. "White men. Soldiers or bandits, and it is hard to tell, but they carry hatred." Clara's stomach twisted. What do they want? Control, fear, anything to undo the peace we hold. Before she could respond, the riders were upon them, charging across the valley in a swirl of dust and shouting. Clara clutched the reins tightly as Taza rode beside her, his face set and calm, betraying none of the tension that gripped his people. The attackers were settlers who refused to accept the union between a white woman and an Apache warrior. Their anger had been brewing, stoked by rumors and prejudice, until finally they had come to exact revenge, to strike at what they saw as an affront to their world. Taza did not hesitate. With a signal to the other warriors, they moved as one, fluid, disciplined, and terrifying in their precision. Clara watched, heart pounding, as men leapt from horseback, spears and rifles raised, and the air filled with shouts and the crack of gunfire. She felt a sharp fear that was different from anything she had known in Boston, a raw, primal terror. One rider broke through the outer line, charging toward her with a raised rifle. Taza was already there. In a movement so fast she could barely follow, he positioned himself between Clara and the attacker, swinging a thick arm to push her behind him. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the ground. Taza's eyes, dark and unflinching, met the man's. "You will not touch her," he said. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of authority and threat alike. The other settlers faltered. The warriors surrounded Clara and Taza, a living wall of shields and spears. The attackers hesitated, realizing their fury would not be enough to overcome the skill and unity of the Apache. One by one they turned, retreating toward the horizon as quickly as they had come. When silence fell, broken only by the distant whinny of horses, Clara sank to her knees, trembling. Taza knelt beside her, brushing the dust from her hair. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice low and steady. "No," she whispered, though her body shook with lingering adrenaline. I thought I might die." "You are stronger than you know," he replied. "But you must not test that strength needlessly." Clara looked up at him, seeing the warrior not as a symbol of fear, but as someone who would stand between her and the world's cruelty. The calm in his presence, the certainty of his protection, filled her with something she had never felt before. Safety, yes, but also trust. Later, as the sun began to sink behind the mesas, the villagers tended to their own, checking for injuries and calming frightened children. Clara walked beside Taza, clutching his arm. The attack had left a shadow over her heart, but it had also illuminated something undeniable. The bond between them had shifted irrevocably. "You saved me," she said quietly, breaking the silence at last. "I did what I must," Taza replied, "but you were not helpless. Your courage is part of why we endured." For the first time, Clara felt the weight of gratitude and admiration mixing with a deep, unspoken emotion. She had been thrust into a life she had not chosen, into a marriage she had resisted, but now she realized something. She was not merely surviving this new world. She was beginning to belong. As night fell over the desert, painting the sky with stars that seemed impossibly bright, Clara sat beside the fire, Taza close enough that their shoulders touched. She reflected on the day's terror and the strength she had witnessed in him, not the ferocity of a warrior, but the quiet power of a man who would protect what he valued, without cruelty, without fear. For the first time since leaving Boston, she allowed herself to imagine a future, not one defined by duty or fear, but by choice and by the bond that had begun to grow between her and Taza. The desert, harsh and unforgiving, had tested her. And in that test she discovered a truth she could no longer deny. Taza was not just her protector. He was the man she could trust with her life and perhaps, if she dared, with her heart. The following morning the desert air carried a rare stillness. The attack had passed, leaving the valley quiet except for the soft murmur of the stream and the low conversations of the villagers. Clara sat on a rock, the cedar box resting beside her, her fingers tracing the carved symbols absently. The events of the previous days, the attack, Taza's protection, the quiet nights under the stars, played over and over in her mind. A rider approached from the east, dust trailing behind him like a warning. Clara recognized him immediately, a messenger from the fort. He carried a letter sealed with the wax stamp of the commander. Taza dismounted first, greeting the man with a polite but cautious nod. Then he handed the letter to Clara. She hesitated. The envelope was thick, the paper brittle. It bore the words that could change everything. Boston called her back. A life she had left behind, a home that still existed in memory if nowhere else, waited for her. She could return, escape this desert, escape the uncertain bond with a man she had only just begun to understand. Yet as she held the letter, she felt the weight of all that had passed. She remembered Taza kneeling by her side during her fever, his steady presence shielding her from despair. She remembered the attack, the way he had thrown himself between her and danger, his eyes unflinching, his hand firm. She remembered the long nights beside the fire, the silence that had slowly become comfort, and the stories of a people whose strength and wisdom had humbled her. With a trembling hand, she opened the letter. Inside, the words were formal, almost cold, but their meaning was clear. Miss Whitmore, if you wish, you may return to Boston immediately. The arrangement of your marriage will be considered null. All debts and obligations have been cleared, and passage will be provided at the first opportunity. Your choice will be respected. Clara's heart pounded. The choice was hers. The freedom that Taza had promised her in the cedar box, that had first frightened her and then comforted her, now rested fully in her hands. She could leave. She could reclaim her old life, safety, familiarity, society, and perhaps even a chance at the love she had imagined in Boston. She looked at Taza. He was tending the fire, his back to her, the sunlight catching the curve of his shoulders, the braid of his hair. He did not ask her what she would choose. He had given her the gift of autonomy long ago. Clara felt a swell of emotion, gratitude, fear, uncertainty, and something deeper, something tender she did not yet have a name for. She thought of the desert, of the people who had begun to accept her, of Nalan's gentle guidance and of Taza's unwavering presence. Finally, she folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her dress. She rose, smoothing her skirts and walking toward him. "I will stay," she said softly, her voice steady despite the rapid beat of her heart. "I could leave, but I choose to stay, not because I must, not because it is expected of me, but because I want to." Taza turned at last, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was a moment of silence, a pause that held the weight of understanding, of respect, of something more. Then he inclined his head, a subtle acknowledgement of the courage and intention behind her words. "You honor yourself," he said simply, "and for that you honor us all." A sense of relief and possibility washed over Clara. For the first time in her life, she realized that freedom was not just the absence of chains but the power to choose, and that choice could lead not to escape, but to connection, to belonging. As they rode back toward the village, side by side, Clara felt the desert sun warm her back, the wind carrying the scent of sage and dust. She glanced at Taza, understanding fully now that their bond had grown beyond duty and survival. It was trust, respect, and perhaps in time something closer to love. For the first time, she no longer felt like a girl forced into circumstances she could not control. She was Clara Whitmore, a woman who had faced the desert, faced fear, and had chosen her own path. And the path she chose led to a life intertwined with Taza, the man who had given her the greatest gift she had ever known. the freedom to decide. Years passed in the Arizona desert, each season etching its rhythm into Clara and Taza's lives. The girl who had stepped off the stagecoach from Boston at 19 had grown into a woman shaped by the land, its people, and the choices she had made. She no longer carried fear in her chest. It had been replaced by knowledge, respect, and a quiet, resilient confidence. The village thrived. Clara had learned the ways of the Apache, the language, the customs, the careful balance with the harsh yet generous land. She could grind corn, weave baskets, and track deer alongside Taza, moving as one with the rhythms of the desert. But more than these practical skills, she had learned patience, humility, and the subtle power of trust. Taza had become more than a protector. He was a partner in every sense. Their bond, forged in uncertainty, danger, and the shared struggle of understanding each other's worlds, had grown into something neither had anticipated but both cherished deeply. He often spoke little, but his actions carried the weight of devotion. He respected her opinions, valued her judgment, and never once attempted to command where she had been given freedom. The cedar box remained with Clara always. On quiet nights when the fire crackled low and the desert sky was a blanket of stars, she would open it and touch the smooth carvings. The silver locket inside, once a symbol of choice, now held not just the image of Taza's mother, but also a tiny collection of mementos, pressed wildflowers from the desert, a feather from a hawk, and a small scrap of paper where Taza had written a single word in her own hand: honor. The villagers told stories of the white bride who had come from the east, a woman who had chosen to stay among the Apache, not out of fear or obligation, but out of understanding and respect. Travelers passing through the territory spoke in whispers of her courage, her resilience, and the unusual marriage that had bridged two worlds. Even outside the village, the story became legend. Settlers who had once sneered or threatened began to speak with a kind of awe about Clara and Taza, about the respect and love that had grown in a place that many had believed impossible for such things to exist. Some said the cedar box itself held magic, a charm that protected their union, though Clara and Taza never claimed such power. It was, they insisted, simply a reminder of choice, of freedom, and of honor, values that outlasted fear and prejudice. When Taza passed decades later, his people buried him with the dignity he had earned, and Clara remained by his side until the end. The grief was profound, yet it was tempered by gratitude for the life they had built together, a life born of defiance, courage, and mutual respect. She kept the cedar box with her always, a symbol of everything that had brought them together and sustained them: trust, honor, and the freedom to choose one another every day. When Clara's own time came, she was buried beside him, the locket resting over her heart. Travelers and descendants of both the settlers and the Apache would come to tell stories of the woman who had dared to cross worlds, of the man who had honored her freedom, and of the cedar box that had been more than wood and silver. It had been a testament to respect, love, and choice. Generations later, children would ask elders about the white bride who married the Apache, and the elders would say, "She came to us not as a gift, not as a burden, but as a woman who chose her path. And because she did, she taught us that true honor lies not in possession, but in freedom, and that love is strongest when it is given, not taken." The cedar box remained, placed carefully in a small wooden shrine beside their graves. Its carvings had softened with age, the silver locket tarnished but intact. Travelers who visited felt the air around it somehow steadier, the weight of choice palpable even decades later. Clara and Taza's story became legend not because of the violence, or the strangeness of their union, or even the desert itself, but because it reminded all who heard it that love, when paired with respect and freedom, could bridge worlds, overcome fear, and endure long after the people who first lived it had passed. And in the Arizona desert, where the wind whispered across red mesas and the stars gleamed like scattered jewels, the tale of the white bride and the Apache warrior lived on, as enduring as the land itself.